Well, we are going to be talking about anxiety, right? All of us are going to anxiety issues with COVID, vaccination, but we have a very special guest today, all the way from Portugal, Maya. Maya is a certified functional coach as well as a certified nutritionist. So she's going to help us navigate how to manage our anxiety naturally. Welcome, Maya.
Thank you very much for having me, Amita. So I'm actually from Canada, but I've been living in Portugal for 20 years. And I started, I guess, in this process of functional medicine, health coaching, and nutrition, because I myself had suffered a long time with anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the reasons why I decided to get into this field. And one of the things that I focus on with some of my clients is anxiety. And at this point, as you know, everyone, like you just mentioned, is really suffering. So anyway, so when you asked me to come today and share about anxiety, I was actually quite excited because in my approach and in the approach of many different people with anxiety issues and anxiety disorders, we look at it holistically. Now, just to speak to your audience right now, I am not a psychologist. So when I work with my clients, I always refer them to someone in the psychology field for anxiety, as there are many types of anxiety and it can manifest in our bodies in different ways. Um, I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder about 3 years ago because of some traumatic events in my own life. And I honestly didn't think that I was somebody that suffered with anxiety. I actually had no idea. So when my clients, for example, go to a psychologist, the psychologist has to really assess um, what's going on, what are all the things that are involved to diagnose you with any kind of anxiety disorder. But I think that, and maybe you'll agree with me, anxiety can manifest in many different ways, like depression, insomnia, irritability. Sometimes it could be difficulty sleeping. People are restless, they have difficulty concentrating. And I think in most people, and especially in myself, in my situation, it was actually just thoughts,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, and
Yeah,
this whole,
thoughts can do that, right? I mean, negative, not that negative thoughts, but your relationships, right, or interactions with other people with negative thoughts. That if you manifest itself, right?
exactly. And I think the thing that's really interesting, like even with some of my clients that have
Mm-hmm.
weight issues, that want to lose weight, and they have, for example, habits of wanting to overeat certain foods or emotional eating. What I was reading this week, which is really interesting, is that, every time we eat something, for example, we get that hit of dopamine, but it's the same thing with negative thoughts. So
Mm-hmm.
every time we trigger a negative thought and we feed on that negative thought, or any kind of thought, really,
Mm-hmm.
we are just continuing that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's really hard to break that cycle of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking, if you are someone who is having these symptoms of irritability, restlessness, fatigue, insomnia,
Mm-hmm.
impaired concentration, this kind of stuff, or just excessive worrying,
Mm-hmm.
then you could really be suffering from a type of anxiety. But
Mm-hmm.
you really do need to see a specialist to be diagnosed with that and get the proper psychological intervention. But basically, where I come in is helping to manage anxiety from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Usually, I start with the nutritional lifestyle aspect of things. How are
Mm-hmm.
people sleeping? How are people moving? Uh, what is their stress like in their job and their family life? All of this kind of stuff. So it's a very holistic perspective, I would have
Mm-hmm.
to say. Um, but as I was telling you just before we started chatting,
Mm-hmm.
I have a more of a functional medicine approach to this type of, let's say, unbalance in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And what I usually do is we look at a person's diet and we see what kind of inflammatory foods they could be eating, that could be causing intolerances. We take a look at your microbiome, how it's being affected. And then we do some other things to try to restore micronutrient status. We look at hormones and neurotransmitters. And since I'm not a doctor, I do have to request these tests or privately or through your doctor. And after we've taken a look at, say, your blood labs and all of that kind of stuff, then we can kind of put into practice an approach that might work for you. But here's the thing. We always have to go step by step because we don't want to cause more anxiety for that person.
So let's talk about, so you're talking about the test and the functional medicine, right? And so what different type of tests, let's say someone walks into your clinic or with the doctor, and what type of different tests would you do to kind of find out that, what is the underlying root cause?
Yeah, so depending on what your doctor can provide, and it's difficult in the United States from what I understand, it really, really depends. And I'm not sure. I'm trying to see here in the United States what.
But that's okay. Let's just talk about your experience. Don't worry about the United States. We just want people to understand, even if it's Portugal, anxiety is anxiety. It doesn't matter where it is.
Yeah, so there's a few things that I look at, and this might seem very basic, but we look at blood sugars. And we see how you're responding to cortisol also. We see how you're responding to insulin. So oftentimes I request a Dutch test for my clients, which is going to show us, right, how the adrenals are working and how those things are working, how your thyroid is functioning. I also, depending on the situation, will often request a neurotransmitter test. So you can ask for that type of testing. But it's good because we can look at the synergy between hormone dysregulation and basically how it could be affecting your HPA axis. So those are the types of testing that I would do.
Okay, so tell us. Okay, so just let's go back to your journey, right? So you're not having anxiety now, right? You look healthy and happy. So what was that journey in the sense, like, it was it nutrition, yoga, mindfulness? What was the journey like from a holistic point of view?
So it was really interesting. I think the thing that helped me the most was, first of all, realizing that I do have general anxiety disorder, or at that time I had general anxiety disorder. And when I was training in functional medicine as a functional medicine practitioner, I learned the emotional freedom technique. So, tapping.
Yeah.
So tapping was something that really, really helped me. And the cool thing too, since I was working with a psychologist, is that we did EMDR.
What is that?
And have you heard of EMDR before?
No, I'm not a doctor. I'm just interviewing you guys.
So EMDR is an amazing psychological intervention that any psychologist who is trained in it would probably practice on their patients who have suffered trauma. And we know that trauma can be anything for anyone. And so what it is it's called eye movement desensitization rehabilitation. So if we think of everything that we do as a behavior, and we think about how our body responds to any behavior that we do, we're always going to either be in the fight or the flight type of response, right? So the sympathetic or parasympathetic. And anything like tapping or EMDR, which stimulates both sides of the brain, is going to create, let's say, new neural pathways, and it's going to basically reduce the threat response in your body. So that was a huge part of my recovery. And I'm so happy that I had someone else to help me. Now, from the nutritional perspective, so I did genetic testing 2 or 3 years ago because my son has autism, and I wanted to know what was going on with him, and I wanted to see what exactly did we pass on to him that made him have autism. And so I did realize that I do have some methylation issues with the MTHFR gene.
Mhm.
And I was an under-methylator. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, people who have anxiety issues could have some genetic mutations on
Mhm.
the MTHFR gene, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and also another gene that's related to that, which is the COMT gene. So once I had started down the path of looking at epigenetics and
Mhm.
looking at nutrition connected to my genes,
Mhm.
there were some other things that I did in my own diet to focus on that. Um,
Mhm.
I had already been eating a very strict paleo diet,
Mhm.
so that was good.
Mhm.
So I had already removed those inflammatory foods from my diet.
Mhm.
Um, but what I would say is one of the biggest things that I felt that I did was focus on foods that were high in magnesium. I was
Mhm.
working on rebalancing my gut. So,
Mhm.
probiotics, prebiotic foods, that kind of thing. And then um, really looking at minerals like zinc
Mhm.
and helping the methylation pathways in my body. So, B vitamins is a huge one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then just omega-3s because of the brain. So that was kind of how I got through it. But I have to be honest and say that the psychological aspect and the tapping and
Mhm.
retraining my brain to think a
Mhm.
different way and
Mhm.
respond was the biggest
Mhm.
thing.
I think that's amazing. I interviewed a psychologist actually last week, and
Oh,
she's a book, right? She's amazing. She's from New York, and Dr. Chloe Carmichael, and she was talking about exactly the same thing. What you're talking about is training your mind, right? Is so
mm,
important, and then mind. Sorry, brain, not right. And brain can be trained with the thoughts that you put into it. It's a feeding of your brain. To your point, and of course, there's we all know yoga is amazing, breath work is amazing. We just wanted to bring something different in addition to yoga and breath work. What else is there, that can help with anxiety with your story?
so it's really interesting that you bring this up because I have a few patients or clients who
Mm-hmm.
have Lyme disease and other autoimmune diseases that I am
Mm-hmm.
telling you, they are so complicated. They're just complicated situations.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the approaches that I often suggest to my clients, which I cannot do for them physically because they have to do the work on their own, is called DNRS. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's
Mm-hmm.
basically okay, it's the dynamic neural retraining system. So it's actually a program that you
Mm-hmm.
can get online and it will help you retrain your brain and help
Mm-hmm.
you, like, for example, now they've got post-acute COVID syndrome, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you can use this training system and this
Mm-hmm.
program to help you.
Retrains
And
brain. Yeah.
exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
it works really well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like a 14-hour
Mm-hmm.
online course that you can do with different types of DVDs, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that they have an online community that supports you, and there's also like a 12-week support group, if I'm not mistaken. But
Mm-hmm.
that's one way. And there's another program that I just learned about. It was about 3 weeks ago, which is quite similar, called
Mm-hmm.
the Gupta program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the guy who started it has a very similar approach to DNRS, and it does focus on meditation approaches and that kind of stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say that other than practical, yoga, breathing, all of that kind of stuff, which is kind of all the same thing, it's
Mm-hmm.
maybe helpful for some people to have a flow, something to have
Mm-hmm.
structure with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Maya, for sharing your story. I think, in addition to yoga and breathing, which all of us know, there are other techniques as well that can help you. And that's why we wanted to bring Maya's story today. She is a certified functional coach as well as a nutritionist. How she used other methods like EFT, nutrition, using the testing, what was the, problems, not problems, deficiencies, right? To really strengthen herself and not have anxiety anymore. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
I would just like to say that, taking this multi-pronged approach to
Mhm.
dealing with anxiety is the best way to do it. Go see a
Yes.
psychological professional, see somebody for
Mhm.
the nutrition side of it, and
Mhm.
hopefully you will get some relief in learning how to deal with general anxiety.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing your personal story. Makes it very, real for all
Sure.
the users. And thank you again, and have a great afternoon. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.